I am Melvin Adams, host of the State of Education podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Many of you have probably seen our guest today on the news. Ian Pryor is an attorney and former Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the United States Department of Justice. He is the Executive Director of the organization Fight for Schools. He has been at the heart of much of the challenge brought by parents against the Loudoun County Public School Board. Ian, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, Melvin.
All right, let's jump right in. So let's go back to the Loudoun County thing. I know you're still very much in the middle of that, but what were the primary issues in Loudoun County, and what caused you to get involved in support of the Loudoun County parents?
Well, it was really an act in three parts, you could say. The first piece of it, I wasn't involved in. I mean, there were parents that were frustrated that schools remained closed, and they would go to school board meetings, they would voice their discontent, their displeasure, and they just didn't feel like anything was getting done, that this was maybe political as opposed to following best practices like other school districts in the country. At the same time, there was these parents that would show up and talk about some of the curriculum issues or some of the direction of the school, specifically its use of critical race theory in teacher trainings and whatnot. And those two things sort of happened throughout 2020, but they didn't really bubble up to the surface of national news beyond, maybe one or two events and school board speakers. Then what happened in March of last year was that there was a private Facebook group called the Anti-Racist Parents of Loudoun County. Now that sounds fine, but in reality, what you had was this group that was plotting against parents who went to speak at school board meetings, either for opening schools or against some of the woke policies that we've been seeing. And they listed something like 60 to 70 people, and they wanted to infiltrate their groups, publicly expose them, hack their websites, even to the extent that anyone had a website on these issues. And it was really a moment of cancel culture. And there had been a couple of things out here in Loudoun over the previous year where you had seen cancel culture manifest itself at the community level. One with a local business, the other one with a young girl who was at college. And parents were fed up, and they said, this is not going to happen. You're not going to put my name on a list in a group with 600, 700 people that included 6 school board members, administrators, people that worked for LCPS. And that really sort of exploded everything and generated, Fight for Schools from that point. We started that PAC really to be able to bring attention to the things that were going on with our school board at our schools. And we eventually started our signature gathering process to remove those 6 school board members who, not just had been in that group, but even after it had gotten exposed, they never said one thing to denounce it. Most of them didn't leave the group. They stayed in and basically gave it their implicit stamp of approval. And so last year, you saw throughout the summer that parents were going out and they were energized. They were getting signatures, by the hundreds. It was certainly a tall task, but we were making a lot of progress. Then you really get to the third act, which was when you had a teacher by the name of Tanner Cross go and speak at a school board meeting as a citizen, providing public comment to a policy for which they invited public comment. And this policy was policy 8040, which allowed students to use the bathrooms of the gender they identified with. Same thing with locker rooms. And it also requires students and teachers to refer to students by their preferred pronouns. He goes up, he makes a statement, opposes this. It's not fiery rhetoric or anything like that, but they put him on suspension. And once that happened, that really drew a lot of attention to this specific policy. He eventually won his case in court and was quickly reinstated. But by then, people were looking at this policy and saying, well, this is not what we want. We need to discuss this more. You can't just, force this down parents' throats without giving them the opportunity to explore alternatives. And in fact, if you actually look at some of the comments that were on this policy, most people were opposed to it. Now, what we found out later was that, at a school board meeting in June 22nd, where the policy was being debated, a gentleman was arrested in the back of the room. And then later that night, the superintendent said, there are no records of sexual assaults in the bathrooms at Loudoun County Public Schools. You fast forward to October, we find out, well, that wasn't the case. The individual that was arrested, his daughter had been sexually assaulted in a bathroom in May, which meant that the superintendent grossly misstated the facts. The school board stood by, did nothing to correct the record. And now you have parents that are seeing a school system that, is really doing everything it can to hide the truth from parents for their own, political reasons, for their own personal reasons, whatever the case may be. And that's really the story of Loudoun County and how we got to where we are today.
Mm. Wow. So, look, you've had some victories and there are lots of issues that are continuing, but what would you say has been one of your most effective strategies in addressing these issues?
Well, I think the Freedom of Information Act for a time was extremely helpful in us acquiring the documents and information that really contradicted what the school system was telling us. But eventually they caught on, and then they started with the exorbitant charges. There was one woman who was charged $36,000 for a Freedom of Information Act over a 6-month period, asking for documents and emails that have the term rape and sexual assault. Yeah. So that right there should concern you, that there's so many documents that would cost $36,000, but also the cost prohibitive nature of that. So we were able to use the Freedom of Information Act, very liberally at first to get that information. I would say the other thing is just communicating with different parents, teachers, administrators, even some school board members to really understand what is going on. It's, you're dealing with an asymmetric situation when you're on the outside trying to figure out what is going on in the school system. And you almost have to approach it like an investigation. Because really that's a lot of what we did was an investigation, and you need to develop sources that will trust you. You need to be trustworthy with them, and you need to talk to people, that you may not think would be helpful, but end up being helpful in some way, shape, or form. And then that information, you're able to get that out to the press. You're able to use that at school board meetings. You're able to kind of have a beat on what is going on within the school system that you can highlight.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us a little bit, and really let's focus on parents out there, and actually even teachers, because there are a lot of teachers that are concerned about what's going on in the schools. They're afraid. Maybe we should break this into two sections, starting with parents. But parents, and what is it? How can they be engaged in fighting back against questionable school decisions? And at what point should a parent escalate their situation by bringing in legal help? And then I guess we could apply the same thing to educators, and maybe the same principles apply to both. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, look, I think the first stop is always going to be for parents is their principal. Or their teachers and their principals. If they have concerns about what's going on, they should talk to their teacher. They should talk to their principals, because a lot of this gets painted with a broad brush that well, this school system is having problems, so everybody must be having problems. That's not the case. There are a lot of good principals within a school system that run their school very tightly. And they can be trusted, and they'll work with parents. It's when you get to the administration level there's where you get the problem. Now, if that doesn't work with the teacher, with the principal, if you have a good school board member, you can bring it to the school board member, and hopefully they can escalate it and get something done. Other than that, if you start going down those roads, then you really need to start looking towards exposing this, whether it's getting it to a media outlet that will cover it fairly, whether it's pushing out this information to other parents, to really making sure everybody knows about it. But what we've seen is that despite the pressure, despite the national pressure from parents in Loudoun County, they still don't respond. They just double down. And that's unfortunately where you have to take legal action. And just last week, one of the titles you didn't mention, I'm senior advisor for America First Legal. On behalf of 11 parents in Loudoun County, America First Legal brought a lawsuit against Loudoun County for a systemic violation of parental rights. And that is, they're not paying for that lawsuit. That lawsuit is pro bono. And that is something where, they're going to be held accountable. They're going to have to answer those questions. And hopefully we're successful. And that's a model, that can be applied throughout the country.
So as far as to teachers or to parents, let's stay with parents for a second. I think you made a good point that it's important for them to start with their teachers, start with their principals, and make sure that things are going on well in their own system, their own schools. Obviously, the most obvious is to have active engagement with their children, find out how things are going, what are they being taught, be engaged, know what's going on. But then, there are some places like Loudoun that's gotten a lot of media attention and everybody knows about Loudoun. But what about that place out there that's kind of rural? And some places say, well, the rural school boards, everything's great there. The problem is, there are some places that things are going fairly well, and it's really based on the school board and the local administration in those systems. But then you have places where it's not okay, and some of those places are very, very rural. And so how can parents in those places where they're not getting media attention and where they're not getting, it's kind of, they're off the beaten track. What should they do? I mean, does it start by really talking to each other and getting parents well informed and united and making sure facts are facts? And then talk us through that a bit for the benefit of parents there.
Absolutely. Well, Loudoun is unique in that it really started with sort of media attention, and then it goes into the legal atmosphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other places, I mean, there's no reason that they cannot find an America First Legal, reach out to those organizations like ours, and if there is a case there, then you bring the case, and the attention will follow. I mean, once something is in litigation, people are going to start paying attention to it. So, there's multiple different ways of doing it. Sure, you can start with let's shine the spotlight of accountability on this school system and build it up from there with parents going to school board meetings, parents going on TV, going on the radio, explaining what's going on, and then that eventually ripens into a litigation. The other option is you start with litigation. If there's an egregious enough offense by one of these school districts, and there's a good lawsuit there that can make a difference not just in the school system, but really throughout the state or throughout the country, then you can start with that, and that will ultimately bring the coverage, bring the spotlight of accountability to what is going on there. So it's really, there's not one size fits all way to do it, but I think that it's finding what is going on is the most important piece, right? And I always say you need to activate, investigate, communicate, litigate. Sometimes that they don't necessarily go in the order of communicate and litigate, but generally when I talk about communicate, that doesn't necessarily mean communicate to the media, because you may not have a lot of media coverage in that area, but it does require communicating with each other on the ground to understand that, hey, this is something that's happened system-wide. This is not just my opinion or one class in one school, but this is actually what the school system is putting in place.
Yeah. So tell us a little more about your organization, Fight for Schools, and for the other America First Center for Legal Equity, Equality, not equity. Sorry about that. That's a term that we hear so often that it just slipped out. Sorry. But anyway, tell us about those groups and what needs they fill in our schools. How wide is the scope? I mean, where all do you work, and how can you be reached?
Sure. Well, Fight for Schools is, up until this point has been primarily Loudoun County, and really focusing on transparency, bringing honesty to the school system, the administration, the school board, and hopefully when time comes next year for our full school board elections, we're going to be able to communicate with voters to let them know the information that they need to make to go out there and vote and do so in an informed way. A lot of times with school board races, at least up until now, people didn't pay attention that much. You might get like one flyer in the mail saying that, hey, vote for me. I'm going to get your kids, better school lunches. And you don't really know where they stand on some of these hot button issues. Well, our goal is to make sure that when we get to those elections, people are fully informed about, where these people stand. Or are they more concerned with their political careers? Are they more concerned with their partisanship? Or are they more concerned with the blocking and tackling of creating and maintaining a good school system? So if people want to get in touch with Fight for Schools, it's simple info at fightforschools.com. America First Legal is a large organization. It's a public interest litigation organization, really that is holding multiple actors accountable, whether it's the federal government, state government, corporations that are discriminating now on these woke ideologies, or school systems. And so we have, a host of different things going on, not just obviously in Loudoun County, but around the country, and not just with schools, but also with corporations, because, corporations hold a very large sway in this country from a messaging standpoint. And, we know a lot of what they're doing is because of their perceived bottom line. And it's important that they recognize that, this is not going to help your bottom line. When you see a company like Disney, go out there and get involved in the parental rights bill in Florida and really just fall in line with the left. They paid a price for that. They paid a significant price for that because it was disingenuous and it was misinformation. And Disney is supposed to be a family place, and here you are advocating against a parental rights bill. So we are certainly looking all over the place for areas that we can get involved in. So, for example, you see a lot of these firms, such as some will say Morgan Stanley or other firms like that will advertise internships at schools, but these internships are discriminatory. They only want certain types of people to apply. Well, that's against the law. And those are the kind of things that we want to make sure that institutions and higher education organizations that are pushing this out to students, that they're held accountable. And that also goes down through K through 12, as we've seen with Loudoun County, and in other areas where we've engaged in oversight activities and assisting parents getting access to materials. I mean, we've got one case up in Pennsylvania, a gentleman by the name of Ben Auslander. He tried to exercise his rights under statutory law, goes in, looks at the teacher trainings provided by Pacific Educational Group. They told him that he couldn't take pictures, he couldn't photocopy, so he starts recording on his phone what he's observing. Well, they kicked him out and they said, you can't do that. It's a copyright violation. Well, on his behalf, America First Legal filed a First Amendment lawsuit in federal court. And through that process, we actually received 166 pages of the materials that he was trying to inspect. And you look at these materials and you see this is admitting critical race theory is part of what schools are trying to do to transform. There's no code words. It just straight up says it all throughout the document. And so it's important to have parents like that are willing to step forward, just like the parents in Loudoun, and put their names on a lawsuit to exercise their rights and their rights on behalf of their children, and to make sure that these school systems are held accountable and that we can return equality to education and get away from the idea that we're going to engage in equity, which really just is guaranteed results regardless of how hard you work, how hard you study, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Ian, you're an attorney. I know you've got a good education, but talk to us just a little bit about your own personal philosophy of education, because I know that, the bottom line is you become passionate and engaged around things you believe in. And so, yes, you believe in the upholding of our laws, and you're using that experience and profession to support parents and schools. But fundamentally, are there core things that you believe from a philosophical perspective that are critical to quality education?
Yeah, well, I absolutely do, and I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, we always talk about getting back to basics, right? Math, science, reading, writing, but I think we need more than that because we're not living in the 1980s when I went to school. We have significant arts programs now. We have significant tech. We have all these kind of things that children can aspire to that they may not have had 30 years ago. So we really need to broaden the scope of what we provide to children and give them the option. Not everybody is necessarily going to want to be a lawyer or a doctor. Some people may want to design video games. Some people may want to be in the arts. We need to provide the opportunity for them to reach their goals, not just necessarily the goals that the education system or parents necessarily want them to do as far as what they do when they graduate from high school or move on into the real world. On things like history and literature, I think that's where we run into a lot of the problems. Uh,
Yeah.
when you go and you start learning history, I mean, I come from a different perspective. I come from a New England background, and the history I learned is probably different than maybe the history in Virginia, but it's still the same. I mean, you're learning basic facts about what happened, and then as you advance, you can learn a little bit more of the context. And if you really want to get into the context of it, well, that's for later years and then in college. I mean, I was a history major in college, so I was able to take some of the things that I learned in fourth grade or seventh grade or 10th grade and really dive in, because at that point you have life experience and you're able to understand that the
Yeah.
different realities that existed 400 years ago, 700 years ago versus what happens today, and that ultimately history is the study of human nature recorded. Unfortunately, what you're seeing
Mhm.
now is that schools want to tell you, not the facts of something and guide you along so that you can critically think on your own. They want to tell you X, right? They want to tell you, well, the founding fathers were all racist because they didn't get rid of slavery when, they wrote the Constitution. Well, when you're in fourth grade, that's probably not the best way to go about it. The best
Yeah.
way to go about teaching history is to teach the actual facts. And then when they get older and they're in college and they decide that they really want to dig into all the different issues that were faced by different regions of the country and different legislators or different representatives and see how these things work and what it led to, so be it. But when you're starting kids off at a very young age, teaching a very distorted and politicized view of our country, that leads down a dark path.
Yeah. Yeah. The reality is, you have to begin with foundational concepts with kids. Because if you have foundational concepts that are based in truth, that are based in recorded history, um, you know, first eye witness recorded history, then what happens is, you know, you have a premise from which you can go.
Exactly.
And you can always learn from both the good and the bad elements of history. And that's how we make a better society. But when you erase certain parts of history, then all of a sudden you lose full perspective, and it's impossible to get a true uh, understanding of reality in the first place, but even how do we make things better? Because there's always going to be something that can get better, and understanding where we've been, where we are now, and that collective growth and understanding can help us shape better ideals for the future potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. This, for me, this encapsulates what we're talking about when you talk about learning about the
Yep.
revolution. When you start off as a young child learning about this, you learn about the basics: the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, Yorktown, the Declaration of Independence. As you get older, you start to learn more complex things. No taxation without representation. How did the revenues and the money spent on the French and Indian War impact Great Britain's decisions, with what they were doing with the colonists? And then you go beyond and you say, all right, now you're a little older, and you learn about actually when they're negotiating the Declaration of Independence and their independence from Great Britain. You learn, well, Thomas Jefferson wanted to put something in the Declaration of Independence, really saying that slavery was abhorrent. But you've got Ben Franklin saying, well, wait a minute, now you're going to lose half of the colonies, if not more. And then how are we going to do this if you've got Great Britain dividing us? Well, how do you solve that problem now, looking back, knowing what you did? That's an exercise in critical thinking that at the right age, I think would be a great exercise. But if you just start by saying the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers were all racist, you never get to that point of critical thinking and figuring out how do you make changes that will lead to different results going forward based on what happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, this is an interesting discussion, Ian, and I appreciate you coming on talking to us. As we kind of wrap up here, what message do you have for our listeners?
Yeah, look, I would say that the key message here is that this is a righteous fight, and it is not going to be an easy one. It is not one that is going to be resolved in a year or 2 years. It is not one that's going to be resolved with an election. It is going to take a long time. It is going to take a decade, maybe more, to really make sure that our educational system is doing right by our children and is depoliticized. It should not be political at all. It should be about building children's foundations so that when they get to the point where they're adults, they're critically thinking about issues on their own, through their own experiences, through looking at source materials, and being able to go out there and be the future leaders of America. So I think that you got to get in this fight, but you have to understand that this is a long haul, but it is absolutely a righteous fight that you should be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this overnight, but it's a fight worth being in.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Ian, for your part, what you're doing, and to all of our listeners, stay engaged, educate yourself, find where you can make a strategic difference, and get in there and stay in it for the long haul. This is not just about our country. This is about our children and their future, which certainly comes back to our country as well. So thank you all for joining us today.